Today, every business is a digital business. Most of us are migrating workloads to the cloud, adopting DevOps tools, rolling out RPA software, and supporting a remote workforce. While opportunity is great, so is the risk of advanced cyber attacks. Many high-profile breaches start with a compromise of privileged credentials. CyberArk is the #1 leader in privileged access management. Talk to CyberArk today to secure privileged access for humans and machines across hybrid and cloud environments and on endpoints. Learn more at securityweekly.com/CyberArk and stay one step ahead of the attackers. The question is simple. Have any of the systems on my network been compromised? The answer is harder than it should be. Enter AI Hunter. Active Countermeasures has automated and streamlined techniques used by the best pen testers and threat hunters in the industry to create AI Hunter, a network threat hunting solution that does the first pass of a hunt for you to identify systems that are most likely to be compromised and scores the results on a scale from 0 to 100. You can then research those systems in depth with AI Hunter. Focus your valuable time on the systems that need your expertise with AI Hunter. Sign up for a personal demo today at securityweekly.com/ACM. Welcome back, everyone, to Enterprise Security Weekly. Join us at InfoSec World 2020, June 22nd through the 24th. Now, a fully virtual event. Security Weekly listeners still receive 15% off the InfoSec World main conference or World Pass. You can go to securityweekly.com/ISW 2020, click the register button, and register with our discount code. Justin Buchanan is here with us. He is the manager of solutions for vulnerability management and offensive security at Rapid7. That's a really long title, but I like it. It makes sense. So he's responsible for go-to-market strategy in those areas. He is driven by his background in IT and deep understanding of customers' desired outcomes, which is a great place to start. Justin, welcome to the show today.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. Really happy to be here.
Nice to have you. Matt Alderman is here with us as well. We're going to talk about, one of our favorite topics, vulnerability management. It never goes away, right? Like, it's always there. I wanted to start, Justin, by gaining some insights into your philosophy and kind of Rapid7's approach to vulnerability management and completing that full. How did you frame it, Matt? Completing the full circle, the full loop,
closing the
loop between identifying a vulnerability, applying a patch, checking to make sure that patch is there, maybe exploiting that vulnerability to help set priority.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a lot of functionality that we can show you today. I don't think we'll be able to get to all of it, but we can definitely walk through getting things in, prioritizing, validating if something can actually be exploited with Metasploit. We can talk about the automation. And then I'd like to round it out by talking about something that I'm very passionate about, which is how do we actually prove the efficacy of all of this work that we're doing to senior leadership? Because I think, to your point, Paul, vulnerability management's been around forever. And the problem is now becoming less of a technical issue because we've pretty much got that well handled to an extent, but it's really now become a much more political issue. And our customers need help communicating to their senior leadership that the work that they're doing really matters to the business and is really helping move things forward. Yep. So after we go through all of that stuff, we can also talk about how do we set the right kinds of goals and communicate and measure them so that we're proving the efficacy of the hard work that we're doing every day.
Justin, you've been doing vulnerability management, pretty much throughout my entire 20-plus year career, right? And you made me realize something that I tried to summarize very succinctly, and I have it in my notes. And it's people aren't breached and organizations aren't breached because the scanner missed a vulnerability. They're breached because someone missed a patch or didn't harden the system via the right configuration, right? It's not because the scanner missed something. Very rarely do I ever hear of a breach occurring going, well, we didn't know about the vulnerability because our scanner didn't find it. Like, no one ever says that, right? It's always someone didn't apply the patch. And now, to your point, the hardest part of vulnerability management has always been convincing other teams the importance of security and to apply those patches.
Right. And also, it's often a funding issue, right? We didn't apply the patch in time because we're short-staffed. And why are we short-staffed? Well, a myriad of reasons that will always be true, but one is definitely senior executives at our companies that are probably not technical don't understand how critical this function is, so they're not potentially funding it appropriately.
Right.
Yeah, Justin, we talked a little bit on the prep call. Data discovery is not the problem here.
Mm-hmm.
Identifying the vulnerability is not the problem. It's the actionability side. It's doing something with the results to protect the environment. And I think that's where Rapid7 has made some very interesting acquisitions over the years to actually help with some of that actionability. And that's what I'm excited to see is how all this comes together. Because it's not only the data collection piece, but it's actually taking that data and doing something with it.
Absolutely.
And Justin, I also think that this varies per region, per organization, but largely, and I really want this to be true, right? Largely, security people are not operational in especially being able to apply the patches to all the systems, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't think we should be. Now, there are cases where people are at now and in the past where we have to be because they're just like no one else is there to apply the patch, so we'll jump in and help, right? But I think we need to enable those operations teams to do it. That's not security's responsibility to apply the patch. And Rapid7 has really embodied that philosophy in the way that you enable patches to be applied through your systems, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And I hope we'll have time to show it today, but the automation's assisted patching is built exactly around that use case, which is we know that we'll never be able to completely remove humans from the patching process. Completely automated patching is almost unattainable, at least in today's environment. But what is attainable is we can speed up all the repetitive and mundane tasks that occur before those key decision points, before we have to go appease the change control board and send our smoke signals and maybe pass an act of Congress. But once that's done, the IT operations person or us or the security professional, if that's the dynamic, can go in and hit deploy. So hopefully one of the things we can show today is how we can do all of that stuff and then stop it right before we click the deploy button, because maybe that is IT operations responsibility, so we leave it there for them to do.
Right. And I think this should be sold as a benefit to IT operations and sysadmins, right? If I put my sysadmin hat on and a system tells me, hey, you're missing patches, I go apply them, I want a rescan to be done and go, hey, you missed that, or, that was good, right? It's a system of checks and balances that should be sold to everyone as it helps everyone, right? I think in the past it's gotten a bad reputation because vulnerability management meant to the operations folks and sysadmins that you got a report that was, like a foot thick of paper dropped on your desk. And that's an arcane way of thinking of it today.
Right. And I think that's another great example of why it's so important that we ladder up these efforts to the larger organizational goals. The team that gets the big report will view it as more of a way to help keep their systems available and continue to ensure their integrity and confidentiality if they know that that's laddered up to a goal of the overall business, as opposed to when it's feels more like this person just gave me a whole bunch of extra work out of nowhere. And we need to remove that stigma that you're describing by making it clear that this is critical to the success of the business overall.
Right. And I like the loop that your Rapid7 has created, right, with the product lines and everything you walked us through. I mean, it was essentially you scan your network. That could be over the network. That could be an agent, right, on the systems. And that agent can do lots of things, which I think is an amazing thing about the Rapid7 platform. But just sticking with VM, discover vulnerabilities, use Metasploit Pro to exploit vulnerabilities, then apply the patches, right, prioritize, and then move forward, right? Maybe prioritize happens before that. But, all of those components in a nice workflow, I think sets up the organization for success, provided you can get buy-in from all the groups. I mean, you're off to the races with that technology, in my opinion. So did you want to show that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Let me jump in and show it to you. All right. So we're starting out here in InsightVM, and I'm starting out here on the threat feed dashboard. We're not going to have time to dig into it today, but it is included complimentary. It's automatically filtered to only show threat intelligence that's relevant to you. It's based on our research and public and private threat intelligence feeds.
Nice. And so, Justin, just for our audience too that listening, InsightVM is essentially Nexpose, right? They should think Nexpose is the scanner component, correct?
Yeah, great call out. So we continue to sell both Nexpose and InsightVM. The primary difference is Nexpose is on premises only. Some customers need that, whereas InsightVM connects to the Insight Cloud, which is our platform that manages the whole portfolio of products. And because of that, it gets a whole bunch of extra functionality where we do a lot of analysis and processing for you in our cloud environment.
Sweet.
So the first thing that we need to talk about is how we get assets in, right? And the way that we do that in InsightVM is with scan engines and agents, as mentioned. We'll start by setting up a site, which is the way that we use to target our scan engines. So we'll call this site vuln validation, because I'll use an example site with the same name when we get to the Metasploit section. Then I'll go ahead and put in the assets that I want to scan, and I can put in IP ranges, I can put in host names, I can put in a CIDR block like I just did. I can also use our dynamic asset groups, which we'll talk about a little bit today, but they're groups that you configure with criteria, and they update dynamically. So you can say, scan my Windows 7 assets here as an example. Also, very importantly, you can exclude certain assets from the assessment or certain groups as well. Once we have the scope of what we want to scan, the next thing that we want to focus on is, okay, what do we actually want to scan these things for? Very popular type of scan to run is this discovery scan that you can see here. And that's because the way that InsightVM is licensed is we charge a per asset price for the number of assets that you assess. The important distinction is we don't charge you for that asset for discovering it, only for assessing it. So people have a big problem of just understanding what they have and where it is. You can use InsightVM and run these discovery scans to get that basic inventory without ever consuming any of your license cap. Once you're ready to then understand, okay, what actually is all the things on this device and what vulnerabilities does it have, then you'll probably run a full audit, or maybe you'll customize a template to your needs, and you'll consume those licenses and you'll pull in the details. Also very important with setting up scan schedules or setting up scans is picking the schedules, right? We'll determine how frequently and on what regular interval we want this scan to run. And maybe even more important than running it regularly is making sure it doesn't run at certain times.
Right.
And that's where the blackout window comes in. So then we can say, we can create global ones or ones by site, and we can say, don't ever run it during business hours, as an example, or whatever the nature
Justin,
of that.
I think that the power in that scheduling too is to schedule it appropriately. I don't want to say around, but in conjunction with your patching schedule, right? Mm-hmm. So you want to make sure that if you have a regular patch cycle, that your scans are running maybe before and maybe after, and noting that in a dashboard, or just always running them after. But be mindful of when the scans run in conjunction with other activities, and kind of schedule that accordingly. Right.
Absolutely. It's the old adage that I scan my Windows systems on Wednesdays, right? So that way it always falls after the patch Tuesday.
Right.
And the reason I want to be thoughtful about setting up those schedules.
I like to schedule them both before and after the patch cycle, because I like to measure the number of patches is one thing, right? But I want to measure the effectiveness of the teams and the tools across the organization as well.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. The next thing to show is scanning on a schedule is great because it'll discover the things that are out there to pull that information in. But one big challenge is things will often be added or removed from the environment in between these cycles. That's why we have what we call discovery connections. These integrate with other systems of record like DHCP, Active Directory, cloud providers, VMware, so that as soon as a new asset in those systems is found or that DHCP lease is issued, InsightVM knows right away. And then what it can do is, instead of waiting for the next scheduled scan, we can create what we call these automated actions. So we can say, all right, anytime that a new asset is discovered in this particular discovery connection, I want you to go ahead and add that to a site, and I want you to kick off that scan right now. And assuming that that site or global blackout aren't in effect, but that really helps augment some of those traditional problems with scan engines and maybe the latency that can exist in the data updates.
So Justin, are you using the SOAR, the command product that you guys purchased to actually create some of those automated actions? Or did you just build that right into InsightVM separately? I'm just curious kind of how that came together.
Yeah. So in the case of those automated actions, that's native in InsightVM. But we
Okay.
also have the automation workflows, which I'm hoping we'll talk about today. And those integrate with SCCM and BigFix for automation assisted patching. And they integrate with firewalls, EDR tools, and NACs for automated containment. And those are leveraging the Insight Connect technology from the command acquisition, which is built in and actually included those workflows at no extra cost as well.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Quickly, it was discussed, but I just do want to mention the agents. They're very popular with InsightVM because they can be used for multiple tools. If you're using our cloud-based SIM, InsightIDR, and InsightVM, you deploy one agent and you get the information for both tools. Agents also continuously report. So you don't have to wait for a scan schedule, and you don't have to wait for the device to join the corporate LAN, especially now with remote work more so than ever. To be able to beacon out is really great. It's also very popular in cloud environments because of the ephemeral nature of those systems. We'll build the agent into the golden image or the AMI, and as soon as that comes online, we'll know. We don't have to wait for assessment on that. The next thing that I want to talk to you about is, okay, we have these assets in, be it from scan engines or agents or some other third-party integrations. Now we need to prioritize what we're going to work on. So when it comes to prioritization, we can see our full list of assets here, and we can see the InsightVM calculated risk score. Let's talk a little bit about how we arrive at that risk score and why it's so powerful. When we drill into a particular asset, we can see all the details that we need to know about it. And we can also see what we're calling here the original risk score. This risk score is an aggregate of all of the individual vulnerabilities risk scores, which we'll look at in a second. But then very importantly, we have this context-driven risk score. The reason why we do this is because we know not all assets are created equal. A vulnerability that exists on my personal laptop is not as important as the same exact vulnerability that also exists on the payroll server. And when we're prioritizing, we need to account for that. So the way that we do that is by dynamically assigning these criticality tags. And you can see here, this one's been tagged with a very high criticality. So a multiplier has been applied to the original score to give us this context-driven score, which is why this asset was at the top of my list. When I look at the individual vulnerabilities on the device, I can see the risk score for each one, which has been added up to reach that score we saw at the top. When we calculate this score, the way that we do it is we do take into account CVSS. CVSS is useful, but it's not sufficient for prioritization. And you can really see that depicted here because I have all of these 10s. I need something much more granular to determine how to direct my attention. So, but we do take it into account. Then we also take into account how long has the vulnerability existed. The longer it's existed, the more likely it is to have been incorporated into attacker toolkits. The skill level required to take advantage of the vulnerability, something that can be exploited by a novice is going to have a higher risk score than something that requires expert tooling or expertise.
Justin, how do you calculate that score?
We have the formula in our help docs, but it's not something that I can recite off the top of my head.
Sure, yeah. So there's a basically a similar version of CVSS, but focused on just the aspect of the skill level that it would take to exploit the vulnerability.
Right. Yeah. So skill level is determined in part with our work with Metasploit to determine how easy or how hard it is to use one of the exploit modules in Metasploit, because there's certainly varying levels of skill required depending on how simple the exploit is to operate or not.
Right. And in multiple factors in there too, not just the skill level of the attacker, but other conditions that have to be present that make an exploit either more difficult or easier to pull off.
Right. Yes. Other things that we take into account when we're calculating the score is, are there any malware kits out there in the wild that are actively using this vulnerability? And does a Metasploit module exist for this or not? And if we scroll down, I have this to show all results, so don't worry, you can change these lists to not be so long. You'll also notice that if there's not a Metasploit module, but there is an ExploitDB proof of concept code entry, we'll use that to influence the score as well. So when I scroll down past all the vulnerabilities on this poor device here, at the bottom, we can see all of the exploits that are associated with the vulnerabilities on this device and all of the potential malware kits that are leveraging things on this device. So I think at this point, the next question that comes to mind is, okay, so I can see that this device has a lot of vulnerabilities that have Metasploit modules associated with it. But to your
You mean
point,
you don't
Paul,
just... So, Justin, you just don't hand this list to the IT ops guys and go, here you go?
No, yeah, I definitely would not advise that. We've got a lot of great ways to help you foster your influence with those teams, which sending them this big list is not going to help increase your influence. But we've got the tools that you need to get this to them in a way that's useful for them. So what we're going to say is, okay, a Metasploit module exists, but what about the other factors in the environment? Can this Metasploit module actually be leveraged? Is there a compensating control in place? Is there some other kind of mitigating factor? And that's where vulnerability validation with Metasploit Pro comes in. So let me switch over to Metasploit Pro. And when we do that, what we're going to want to use here is what we call the vulnerability validation wizard. So I'll click on that, and we'll give the project a name. So we'll just call it Vuln Validation. And then once we do that, we need to connect the wizard to a InsightVM or Nexpose console. And then we also need to choose a site. So previously, I set up a site called Vuln Validation, added 5 assets to it, and assessed it with InsightVM. So now we'll go ahead and click Start. So when we do that, we'll see, okay, my hosts have been imported. And in just a second, it'll pull in my vulnerabilities and their associated exploits. As that's working through, we can see we've now successfully shelled 4 out of 5 assets here. And this means that at least one exploit was successful on these assets, and a session has been opened that could potentially allow us to take control of the device. And you can see that there's currently 2 open sessions right up here at the top. And as this finishes running, those sessions will be closed out by default, because the point of vulnerability validation is not to actually take control of the device or perform data exfiltration, but just to test if it works and then close that connection and just record our findings. So now we're done, and we can take a look at our results. So here in the results, we can see the 4 devices that we shelled, and we can see the one that got out free and clear, must have had some kind of compensating control in place. I can click on the 5 hosts here and look in a little bit deeper. Again, there's my 4 that got exploited and the 1 that made it out. But what's interesting is when I click on vulnerabilities. So now we can see all of the vulnerabilities that were tested and successfully exploited, or the ones that were tested but it failed because of some mitigating factor. You'll also notice there's a fair amount of vulnerabilities that were not tested. And that's because by default, this wizard is configured to only run exploits that have a very high reliability. That's to avoid any potential system outages or other odd behavior. But if you wanted to test with some of those modules that are less reliable, you can do so. We just would recommend doing so at off hours and in a more controlled environment. So now that I have my ones that have been validated, I can select them, and then I'll click this button to send them back over to InsightVM. We'll push these validations to InsightVM, which is great, and now we're all set. So now let me switch back over to InsightVM, and what we're looking at here is a filtered asset search. So I'm saying, show me all the assets in my vuln validation site where validated vulnerabilities are present. There's the 4 assets that we shelled. I'll click on the first one. This page is familiar now at this point. You'll notice that there's currently no criticality tags, so the scores are the same. When I scroll down to the vulnerability list, we see the same behavior here. This vulnerability has a Metasploit module. This one has ExploitDB proof of concept. But here's the really important one. This module has been validated by Metasploit Pro. And that's what that red exclamation point indicates. That's all well and good. But what I really want is not just for this icon to show up in this list, but I want this to impact the risk score so that way these things come up to the top of the page. And what we can do to do that is create what we call a dynamic asset group. So dynamic asset groups let us set criteria such as validated vulnerabilities are present, and then they will dynamically update any devices that have that criteria. And when those devices are found, we can add custom tags, locations, owners, or importantly, criticality multipliers. So in this case, I'm going to say any of those assets that have those vulnerabilities should be applied a very high criticality tag, and then that will move them right up to the top of the list. As a quick aside, these dynamic asset groups are very powerful. You can combine all types of criteria together to use it for organization, scan targeting like we talked about, reporting, and prioritization as just discussed.
Yeah, so like a really basic rule, I think, Justin, would be for Windows systems, right, that are, and that can be dynamic, right? That doesn't have to be what I tell it Windows systems are. It can be like, well, hey, when you discover Windows systems with critical vulnerabilities that are remotely exploitable, automatically make them the highest priority or something like that, right?
Yep, absolutely. Absolutely. So now we've gotten some assets in, we've prioritized, we've validated to prioritize even further. And now it comes time to, hey, we need to actually get some work done here. We need to fix these things. The first thing that is huge is this automation. So we're not going to have time to go all the way into it, but what the automation is going to let us do is create workflows based on different criteria. So in this case, we're saying if this vulnerability is found in the Boston site, we're going to kick off this automation. And when we do that, we'll then choose which workflow we want to use. So as I mentioned, we have automation-assisted patching with SECM. We also have it with BigFix. And then a whole nother topic of conversation, we have automated containment with endpoint detection and response tools, firewalls, and NACs. But in the case of this one, we can see that this system is going to do 44 steps on your behalf to try and get these things patched in SECM. Mm-hmm. And as I alluded to earlier, it's actually going to do all 44 of those steps and then stop and not actually go the last inch of that process. And that's very much intentional because we want to have everything all wrapped up in a nice bow and sitting there for the IT professional to come in and just click deploy.
So Justin, does the IT operations staff have access to InsightVM to be able to build those workflows and monitor them, and then they also have a login to, an account in SCCM where they would go apply the patch?
So we do see some organizations give their IT operations team members accounts for InsightVM so that they can log in and access those things directly. That's a little bit less common. The way that we usually see it is only IT operations has credentials to SCCM and only security operations has credentials to InsightVM, which is why these integrations are so critical, right? Because it's so hard to bridge the gap between those things.
I know.
But that's why we do all of our work on our side, and then we give it to them, ready for them to go in their tool that they do have access to.
Yeah. I do want to encourage enterprises to get to that point where your operations staff is using those security tools such as InsightVM.
Oh, absolutely. Huge. I mean, I think that's ideal. And some of our most effective customers are doing just that and using things like our remediation projects together. Mm-hmm. But it's just not as common as perhaps the ideal would be.
And so, Justin, just to clarify, those 44 steps that that were done through the workflow basically was sending all the data to SCCM based on the assets, the vulnerabilities, and the patches needed, and really created that SCCM patch package, for lack of a better term, and got it all ready to go. And literally, if IT operations were comfortable with what was in there, all they would really have to do is push the patch button.
That's right.
Is that kind of what it did? All right, perfect.
Yeah, so a lot of the steps are things like matching up the InsightVM assets with the asset groups in SCCM, right? That's a seemingly simple task, but we call this thing over here Windows Server, and over in SCCM it's being called something else. So we'll do that that matching, and then we'll match the patches to the vulnerabilities. Then we'll match it to what they're calling the patches in SCCM. So it's pretty. You get to 44 steps pretty quickly to get all that stuff lined up and ready to go. But the end result is, if you're comfortable with it, you select the package and you press deploy and you're off to the races.
That's awesome.
So I think we're almost out of time. So I just really want to get on my soapbox really quickly about goals and SLAs. One of the things I mentioned is one of the hardest challenges that we see customers experiencing now is not a technical challenge, but instead is reporting how valuable their work is to the organization, especially when they work at a non-technical organization. We have so many customers that are in finance and healthcare and manufacturing. Their senior executives don't understand cybersecurity. So what we need to do is give them tools that help them communicate. Hey, I know that this is a thing that you really care about, and here's a way that I'm working to help towards that KPI that you care about. So a great example would be, even non-technical executives right now want to make sure that remote employees are secure and productive. So when the security team thinks about how do I help my senior executive achieve their goal of that, we can look at things like Bluekeep. Bluekeep's a vulnerability that impacts RDP. And we can say, my commitment to you to help you with your goal is that if we see a Bluekeep vulnerability, we're going to patch that within 21 days. 21 days is probably the realistic timeline. I think the ideal timeline would be more like one, but we have to be realistic. And what we can do is we can track how are we doing over time at adhering to this commitment that we made. And that enables you to have a much more informed conversation with executives without getting into the speeds and feeds technical nature of it. You can talk to them about, hey, I was only able to meet that commitment that I made to you 50% of the time because we need more staff, or we need more training, or we need more tooling, or because of all the investments and all the great work that we did. Last quarter, we hit it 50% of the time, and now we're up to 75%. And executives can look at those types of reports and really understand the efficacy of the program that's being run.
Yeah, Justin, I call it making work visible, right?
It's making work visible. That's great. Can I use that?
Absolutely.
That's fantastic.
Well, it's important in security because, if nothing's happening, it means we're doing our job, right? So we're doing stuff. So making that work visible is extremely important, right? For a whole lot of reasons, to make the business understand how we're making decisions, what work we're doing to keep those systems secure. So
right. One popular SLA that a customer of ours is using is, it's a hospital, and they really care about billing, making sure that the bills are going out on time and being consistent. So the security team has an SLA of patching all critical vulnerabilities on the billing system within 7 days. Mm-hmm. And that allows them to have the conversation of, hey, I know the thing that you really care about is the bills going out on time, but by keeping that system available, I'm helping you achieve that goal.
Right. And
we've been really successful at upholding our end of the bargain. And executives say, great, thank you. Like, that is really helping me with something that's painful for me. Mm-hmm. And that's giving that team visibility about how they're lined up to the overall objective.
Yeah, tracking metrics has always been a very interesting challenge, I think, for a lot of organizations. You have to align them back to business goals and objectives, I believe. And you just gave a very valid case. Business goal is to get bills out on time. How do I, as a security professional, make sure that that billing system stays up to get those bills out. And you create metrics that can then tie back to that business goal. And that's a very important connection that I don't think a lot of organizations do well, but definitely if you can do it right, now you can justify back to the business how you're actually enabling the business to succeed.
Right. One of the things that we suggest to our customers is you should have operational security metrics, and then you should have the metrics that you report to the board. And when you get really good at this, you get to the point where you actually keep those operational metrics to yourself and you never tell them. You only tell them how you helped keep the billing system in place. You don't tell them how many vulnerabilities you remediated last month. Right. And that's the most ideal state. But when we can separate those two, to your point, I think that's when we get really effective at advocating for ourselves.
Justin, that was fantastic. And for our audience that wants to learn more, you can visit securityweekly.com/rapid7. You can get a demo. Try it now. Is it a free trial? It depends on which product.
Yep, there's a free 30-day trial, and there's also a very long demo because we have so much that we couldn't talk about, like container assessment and cloud configuration assessment. So there's plenty to check out.
Fantastic, Justin. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And that will conclude this episode of Enterprise Security Weekly. Thank you, everyone, for listening and watching. We'll see you next time.